Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. We want to welcome you to our webcast today about captives, decision points, and timing for physician roll-ups. Today's presentation will be recorded, and the slides will be sent out and distributed after the presentation. My name is Linda Jones. I am the Managing Director and Healthcare Leader for the Southeast Zone at Marsh, as well as the Physician Center of Excellence Leader for the U.S. I work with colleagues and physician group clients around the country, providing advisory services and strategic planning for their risk program. I have over 30 years experience in providing clinical risk management, claims management, insurance advisory, and captive insurance company advisory services, and work with healthcare organizations around the U.S. Joining me on the panel today is Art Krasinski. He is the Managing Director for Marsh Captive Solutions, and he is the leader of our National Captive Advisory Practice. He's based in Connecticut, and he works with clients and organizations of single parent and association captives, as well as risk retention groups. Art has worked with physician supergroups and other healthcare organizations around the country, and we're excited to have him join our panel today. And we also have Jesse Crary, who is a shareholder at Primer, Piper, Eggleston, and Kramer based in Vermont. Vermont is a captive domicile state that supports captive insurance company formations, and they have more captives than other states. And he has plenty of experience in forming and providing ongoing corporate and regulatory counsel to single parent, group, protective cell captives, as well as risk retention groups. Our topics of discussion today is we're going to be discussing what has led to the growth in physician captive formation as a result of the tightening of the medical malpractice market. We will also be discussing the decision-making and the feasibility process of does a captive insurance company make sense to you, how to go about doing that and conducting a feasibility study, as well as ongoing implementation and operations of captive insurance company operations. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start about the physician medical malpractice market and what's leading to the growth of physician insurance companies through a captive insurance company model. So the medical malpractice insurance company market has been soft for a number of years. However, in 2019, it shows that it was unprofitable, and it was the 6th consecutive year of underwriting losses for medical malpractice insurers. And so as you can see on the slide, they had 107% combined ratio, and that is an insurance term that really evaluates how profitable an insurance company is in that particular line of business. So for every dollar they take in, how much are they paying out in claims and expenses? So for a combined ratio of 107%, every dollar that they're taking in premium, they're spending $1.07 in losses and expenses. So obviously it's ideal to have lower combined ratios, but what we're seeing is with that, you're seeing a number of insurance companies consolidating. Some are withdrawing from the medical malpractice market, and others are considering what is their future going forward for writing this particular specialty line of business, because it is such a long-term coverage, and tail claims could last, especially baby cases, for a number of years. So what we're seeing is rates increasing in all specialties, and sometimes we're seeing 40, 50% rate increases year upon year, and some as high as 80%. So it is a challenging market, and captive insurance companies are a way to try to gain control of that, structure the program a little bit differently, take advantages of some of the structural changes, and try to reduce your overall expense associated with medical malpractice losses. I'm based on the East Coast, and as you can see, the record number of jury verdicts is greater than $10 million for the last few years. In particular, there is a claim to fame is in Baltimore, a recent verdict of over $200 million on a fetal injury death case, or actually still alive, that's still outstanding. So we're definitely seeing severity, the amount of settlements and verdicts increase. However, the claims frequency, the number of cases that are filed, remains flat to low. Okay, next slide. So on this slide, this is the medical professional liability MPL premium over the last 20 or so years, 30 years. So you can see, in 2003, 4, 5, that was when we had high insurance company premiums, and thus we had a lot of captive insurance company growth, where physicians and healthcare organizations were trying to gain control of that expense, and we formed a number of programs back then. There was also a lot of regulatory changes and states trying to provide relief to physicians because of the worsening malpractice crisis. But since then, in the 2000s, we did see a decrease in the premiums, overall premiums, but we've seen an uptick the last couple of years. And it'll be interesting to see where 2020 shakes out at the end of this year. And this slide I thought was interesting. So you could see the gray portion is the amount of increase in premium. Turquoise is no change, and then black is decreased. So in the 2018 year and 2019, we're seeing growth in the increase. And I would anticipate in 2020 that that gray bar will be at least 50% of that total column. So we're expecting rates to continue to increase and premiums increase for physicians and other healthcare providers. So as we talk about the market, we have to just mention, the impact of COVID-19 and what's happening. We don't quite know yet how this will overall impact the insurance market, but we're definitely seeing that as part of the support for increasing rates. Interestingly, I'm even seeing support of increasing automobile insurance rates as a result of COVID. I'm not quite sure the connectivity, since there's fewer people driving, but it is a market response because of what they are facing in the stock market. So we are seeing premiums increase, although there are some chances for a decrease in volume and the potential to have some type of rollback or suspension of coverage while you're not operating. But claim frequency has declined. The severity portion, cases are not going to trial right now. We're, having Zoom mediations, which is a new experience for everyone. Some cases are settling for plaintiffs that really want to get, money needed quickly, but others are just really, lingering out there until they could be finally resolved. And this doesn't necessarily apply to the senior care market because of what we're seeing in the infectiousness in senior care and nursing homes. There has been an increase in claims against nursing home providers. There's also been liability immunity protections in about half of the states. They all vary. There is no standard, and it can't prevent a plaintiff from filing a suit, but there is various protections in these state-specific immunity laws to try to reduce the risk and liability for healthcare providers involved in the support of investigation and creation of drugs and treatment for COVID, as well as overall immunity. Once we come out of the COVID, pandemic, there is a concern of what will happen in future claims. Will there be, a severe increase in claim filings in the future? Or will the halo effect support healthcare providers? And by halo effect, I'm talking about the trend that healthcare providers are being supported as heroes. And there's not a lot of criticism against them because there isn't a standard treatment on how to control COVID. Doesn't mean that there won't be in the future, but right now there is a potential for a halo effect in having support for healthcare providers. Okay, next slide. But the potential for allegations against physicians and other healthcare providers resulting as a failure to diagnose COVID is significant. The question of did they get COVID by coming to your organization or your doctor's office, or what that means based on that, or community spread. And most interesting is what's happening to the delay in elective or non-essential services and procedures and cancer treatments in particular. So there is a concern of what that might mean in the long term should that healthcare provider have insisted that the patient come in for, a particular screening exam, what's happening to them with regard to ongoing oncology treatments. So, we don't know ultimately what that's going to mean, and we're really trying to, predict, but time will tell is what's happening on those potential cases for some delay in diagnosis of COVID. Okay, and the next slide. So with the market hardening, there is this potential for kind of controlling your destiny. We talk about it going on a journey of forming your own insurance company and your captive insurance company. There are a number of different places to form that, the US or out of the US. But what we're going to be talking about today in particular are physician captive insurance companies, and whether that is an employment model or a management services organization model, otherwise known as an MSO. So really looking at that potential to form a captive to start by insuring your professional liability or your medical malpractice exposure. That is typically the highest price insurance that you're purchasing, and it usually is the focus and the impetus to form a captive insurance company. However, there's a number of other lines of insurance that you could include, and we're going to be giving one example of that about employer stop loss or provider stop loss later on in the presentation. So really looking at the life cycle of these physician supergroups as they started out, in the US, usually they were within their states, but as they march across the country and get into other states, a national platform is a solution, although you could support it down to individual offices or by states. But the markets is changing for professional liability insurers. So you're seeing that consolidation. Some are not running that business, as we mentioned. And as the employment model changes for physicians, and whether that is with a hospital or a physician supergroup, it's changing the landscape for the insurance companies that write that specialty business. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Art now to talk about the feasibility process. How do you go about considering forming a captive insurance company? Does it make sense to do that? And then the process. So Art, you want to take it away?
Thanks, Linda. And as you said, most physician groups, be it part of a hospital or a standalone group or part of a large roll-up organization, will focus on medical malpractice because that's where the money is. But there's nothing to prevent a captive from writing other lines of cover. But today, we should keep medical malpractice in mind. I'm going to go through just a couple of steps to make sure we're all kind of grounded on the difference between retaining risk versus financing risk. And every year, as you go through your renewals, your broker probably has a discussion about market conditions and what your deductibles are and how much credit you get for going up or down. So every year you'll go through this process of what is the right amount of risk we can retain. We can retain. And if there's if you're a large entity, you may have an actuary help you. But at some point, before you start buying insurance, you're going to have this retention decision. What you want to get rid of, you'll transfer to the insurance company, and what you want to keep, you'll then decide, how should we keep it? Should we just self-fund it? Should we set up a captive for it, or should we set up some sort of structured multi-year program? So there's a number of methods of pre-loss funding. Today, we're going to focus on captive insurers and reinsurers. Next slide, please. This is just a simple definition. A captive insurance company is a licensed insurance company. It's going to have what's known in the industry as a certificate of authority or a license to operate from a given state or jurisdiction. It's a somewhat limited license. Captives are captives because they have special legislation that allow for reduced capital requirements, reduced reporting requirements, but as such, generally a pretty limited business plan, which is to ensure risks of its owner or risks that its owner decides because of an affiliation or a business relationship they want to insure. Generally speaking, the retention decision happens first, and then the financing decision takes place, i.e. the decision to retain risk by the organization has already been taken, and now the issue is, do we want a captive or not? And if you think about an organization chart, a captive is going to be a wholly owned subsidiary, generally owned by the parent organization that will put in capital. If there are profits, will receive dividends and will insure the operating subsidiaries. The next slide, if there's any that you remember, this is probably the most important slide. These are the key considerations as you think about, will a captive fit in our organization? These are the 10 checkpoints that you will want to review. And first and foremost is getting a handle on loss information. Generally that involves engaging an actuary, and they're good for a lot of things, but in particular, picking out or predicting what your losses are going to be next year based on a look in the rear view mirror, a look at what kind of inflation and general trends are, and coming up with that loss pick is step one. And then step two is identifying all of the expenses that are going to be associated with running this captive. So if we think about the role of an actuary, it's to predict losses and to come up with premiums so that we don't have to worry about any combined loss ratios over 100%, i.e. the ones that got us to the point where we are today. Part of any captive feasibility study and decision point is how much reinsurance are we going to buy? And if we want to keep more risk and spend less on reinsurance, that's going to impact how much capitalization is put in. So as we think about financing, the first item was premiums. The second is capital. And reinsurance is a good substitute for capital and vice versa. Next issue is tax issues. And in many cases, tax issues are the key differentiator between an unfunded self-insurance program and a funded self-insurance program. If the captive qualifies as an insurance company, it may be able to get insurance company tax treatment, which means that there are some tax benefits, both for large institutions as well as small ones. Another issue to take into account is the premium taxes or state self-procurement taxes. And these are taxes that are imposed on insurance. And again, another issue to think about as you evaluate going to captive insurance versus self-insurance. Captives are a long-term opportunity. There's a lot of mental wear and tear as well as expense that will go into forming a captive, and you've got to look at it as a permanent change in your risk financing mechanism. It's not a 1 year, oh, I'll get in this year because rates are going up and get out next year. Think about it for the very long haul. Tied in with capital will be the ability of the captive to withstand any significant deviation in expected losses. We're going to talk about exit issues. Many companies want to find out what the exit plan is before they even enter. We've got a slide that will detail that later on in the presentation. It's easy to identify the amount of spend for service providers to run the captive. It's sometimes hard to estimate the additional time and resources internally that will be needed. It's generally less than what companies think. It's going to be a little bit of time from a lot of organizations, meaning that your legal folks will invest some time, claims, risk management, treasury, CFO, compliance. Everybody will have one more company to deal with. You generally will not need a full-time resource, but don't underestimate the amount of folks within your organization that might be impacted. And lastly, in the study, you want to make sure you have a good handle on what those external startup and operating costs are. The next slide, please. There's a lot going on here, but captives can be used to support a couple of different objectives. Corporate objectives, it can support the business units, protect human capital, and it provides access to capital. I'm not going to go through these in details, but as we think about medical malpractice, having a captive can certainly provide more financial certainty as the premiums are going to be based on an organization's own losses. And the more risk an organization takes, the more it controls its losses from a good safety and loss control program, the more stable costs will be. From a supporting business units, a big component of captives is risk management. As you move from insurance to self-insurance to having a captive, loss control and risk management become much more apparent, much more integral part of the plan. Depending upon how the captive is structured, and I've worked with a number of large physician groups where the physicians themselves had individual capital accounts, profit accounts, and if there's anything that helps drive better risk management, it's when the physicians have a stake in the plan. Moving to the next slide, please. Much like Linda's chart earlier, this one maps the development of captives. And as you can see, there's not a direct correlation with hard markets. As companies become more sophisticated in financing and in financing risk, most companies, don't necessarily take more risk when they go into a captive. They simply choose to finance it differently. And we can see that the numbers have peaked in 2015. A lot of the decline since then, going from 6,800 to 6,100, has resulted from some IRS and some compliance issues. There are some special laws that allow tax advantages for small captives, and in fact, there still is a little controversy going on between those who form these smaller captives to get tax advantages and what the IRS thinks their business purpose is. But that's been the reason for the decline. Most large organizations, continue to have captives. Most of the captives forming these days are for large organizations. And I would guess that with what's happening with 2020 renewals, we're going to see an upwards tick when the numbers come out for 2020. Next slide, please. 80% of the captives are single owner captives. That's the largest sector, and I would say 20% are groups and associations. And there's some good examples out there. If you think about all what's known as bedpan mutuals, the state mutuals that were formed, I guess, in the late 70s, those were some of the original, group captives. They were owned by their insureds. All of the doctors, by de facto, a mutual has the owners are insureds and vice versa. But again, largest sector is a single owner. There's some good examples out there still today of group captives. Branches are a unique creation where a foreign captive can create a branch in the U.S. And get access to TRIA, which is the U.S. government terrorism pool, and be able to write U.S. employee benefits, both of which require a U.S. domicile. And my guess is out of I think there's probably around 300 risk retention groups, probably half of them are for medical malpractice, focused on doctor groups. A lot of hospitals have formed risk retention groups to ensure their physician population. There's a lot of large practices that have formed risk retention groups. And there's others that are sponsored by MGAs and brokers and such. So risk retention groups are unique to the U.S. They can only do liability lines, and unlike other captives, risk retention groups are able to operate in all 50 states, meaning that you can transact business after doing some simple filings in those states, meaning you can sell, you can have presentations, you can handle claims, you can have board meetings. So the ability to transact business is enhanced with a risk retention group. Next slide, please. There's also been a lot of interest in the last probably 5 to 10 years about cell captives. Cell captives are an easy way to get into the captive business, and they're formed by a third party. Many of the major brokers and insurance companies have cells that are rented to others. And the reason you would do that is you are able to share some of the common expenses. So audits and actuarial work and license fees are all shared, meaning that the operating costs of a cell company are going to be somewhat less than a single owner captive. On the other hand, you're not going to have quite as much control. So speed to formation is something that a cell facility offers. And keep in mind that both cell facilities as well as typical captives are protected from each other. So regardless of what happens to your neighbor next door in terms of profits or losses, you will not be sharing risk unless that's part of the design. Moving to the next slide, please. Here's a quick picture of what the cell facility looks like, and there are a number of different cells. It seems like every different domicile calls legislation differently. It could be protected cell companies, incorporated cell companies, segregated cell companies, but when all is said and done, this is what they look like. The core will be owned by the third party, again, either broker or insurance company, or sometimes even large healthcare facilities will have a core and then use cells for different types of business. And again, all of the cells are legislatively separated from each other. Next slide, please. Everyone wants to know what this all costs, and don't focus as much on the numbers as much as the categories. So starting off, the first step would do a feasibility study, which is basically kind of an educational process, a due diligence process to develop a business plan and provide the document that's going to be needed to basically make sure everybody within your organization is on the same page. Once that feasibility study is done, there will be some startup or implementation costs. And Jesse's going to get into what those items are later on in the presentation. But starting up the company means you're going to have regulatory filings. You'll need to hire a lawyer to do articles and bylaws, shareholders agreements. There'll be actuaries that are required, as well as kind of filling out the forms and kind of marching it through the state licensing process. When the company is up and running and open for business, there will be operating costs. Typically, regulatory, legal, actuarial, audit, and captive are the easy ones to think about. But think about what the internal costs are going to be as well. And if you're going to have any special costs because of tax opinions or extensive work on shareholder agreements, if you're doing a group type captive, that should be measured in that feasibility study as well. Certain U.S. jurisdictions have a domicile premium tax. Those generally range from 25 to 50 basis points. The offshore jurisdictions have government fees similar to some of the U.S. Premium tax fees or minimums. Something that applies to all captives is self-procurement tax, which is similar to a surplus lines tax, but based on the state that you're in, there will be a tax imposed on the insured for any insurance placement made with a company not licensed or admitted in that state. So as we look at domiciles in a minute, we'll see that there's now a lot of jurisdictions in the U.S., and one of the reasons for that was as a self-procurement tax avoidance arrangement, trying to eliminate the tax by forming in the state where the captive law and the insurer are located can go a long ways towards eliminating a lot of expenses associated with it. Earlier, we talked about capitalization versus reinsurance costs. If it's reinsurance, it'll be in your operating cost budget. If it's capital, that's going to be to protect against severe losses or lots of frequency. Every jurisdiction has different capitalization rules. Two ways of thinking about it would be as a ratio of premium to capital. Another would be based on the number of the largest retention that you have. You have to make sure that you have enough capital to cover that largest retention. A little bit on domicile. The next slide. This is generally the second thing that folks want to talk about, and I'm not going to get into this in any detail, but this shows you kind of the largest jurisdictions, Bermuda and Cayman being the largest offshore, Vermont being the largest onshore. Cayman has a particular niche for healthcare captives. In fact, anecdotally, the Cayman Islands got into the captive business via a healthcare captive that was turned down in Bermuda in the 70s. And as a result, I'm going to guess that probably half the captives located in the Cayman Islands have some sort of healthcare component. Next slide. And this is kind of something that's happened in the last, let's call it 30 to 40 years. There was one U.S. captive jurisdiction in the mid 80s. Vermont was actually the second one, which is the most popular U.S. jurisdiction. And since then, now I think there are 38 states that have captive legislation. Some of them have zero captives. Some of them don't want any captives. It was imposed by their legislature. And if you've got really good eyes, you can see on the right-hand side where the numbers are. And again, one of the reasons for the growth in the number of different jurisdictions goes back to this tax thing. So if you're a company that's located in Texas and you've got $10 million of premium, if you form a Texas captive, you're going to save approximately 5% or $500,000 of premium taxes simply by forming a captive in Texas as opposed to going offshore. So one of the things that, again, as you do your study, the first place to think about from a jurisdiction perspective is the state you're located in if they have a captive law. Obviously, if you're in California, that won't be possible, but that's probably California and Pennsylvania are the largest states so far that do not have captive laws. Moving to the next slide. This is kind of the process that you'll go through doing a feasibility study. And I'm going to go through this quickly. There was another slide that had parts of it, but your study should identify the risk that you're going to take, the lines of cover, the amount of risk per claim, any aggregate limits, how much premium, what kind of reinsurance is going to be involved, so that we can start to quantify how much risk the captive is going to be there for. From an opportunity perspective, what are the operational efficiencies that we'll get from a captive, as well as the financial efficiencies, i.e. what's the difference between self-insuring and putting risk into a captive. Third bullet, we talked about this earlier. We went through a slide that went through all of the cost issues, but what are the operational issues? Is it going to help from a premium allocation perspective? Will it force an organization to have better record keeping, better compliance when it comes to retaining risk? And will there be some potential tax advantages that come for-profit organizations by forming a captive? That all gets put into financial analysis. That financial analysis, along with the actuary's review, will help drive capitalization. Will the captive need a front? Meaning, will we have to go to a licensed admitted insurance company for either services or for the certificates of insurance we need to meet contractual requirements? Will a risk retention group that writes direct work? Or will just a regular, plain old vanilla captive work from a direct writing perspective? Big part of the study and big part of what the operating costs will be. We talked a little bit about domicile earlier. You'll want to know what the implementation plan is. So think of the feasibility study as everything you need to get you from kind of where you are today to the point where you're ready to implement kind of with a go, no-go decision. The next slide, we talked a little bit about the data that's required. And study's probably going to take 30 to 60 days, assuming everybody moves as fast as they can. But basic starting information will be, parent company financial information, organization charts showing all of the legal entity or business operations, what the tax rates are, schedule of insurance, allocations of payroll revenue or physicians by state, and rates of return. What do we assume the captives are going to get on their investments? So we've spent the last few minutes talking about what it takes to do a feasibility study and forming a captive. On the next slide, we talk a little bit about, what if we don't need it anymore? And if you think about the market slide that Linda had earlier, where, rates kind of peaked in 2005 and then dropped precipitously, some organizations found themselves with captives that really didn't need them anymore. So without going into a lot of detail here, you can either run off the captive, meaning you stop using it going forward and let all the claims pay off. But keep in mind that you're going to have operational expenses as long as that captive is going. Or the second option is to commute or contractually transfer those liabilities either back to the parent organization or to a third-party insurer. So as you think about, okay, well, we've got this captive, we really don't need it anymore. What's the best way of exiting it? Not necessarily to spend a lot of time on it when you're doing the feasibility study, but be aware that it's much easier to get into a captive than out of a captive. And my next slide is not about medical malpractice, it's about medical stop loss. And what we've seen recently is a lot of organizations that are buying stop loss insurance, and I think some of the major healthcare organizations with tens of thousands of employees probably aren't. But if you've got less than 10,000 employees, you probably are buying medical stop loss. And if you pay attention to what's going on with the costs of employee health plans and some of the severity, it's not uncommon to see organizations spending, $2, $3, $4, $5 million a year for stop loss insurance. One of the ways of mitigating some of that cost is to use your captive and have the captive access reinsurance. And medical stop loss is one of the few areas of coverage where there is a definitive, measurable difference between the cost of buying stop loss in the retail market versus the buying of the cost of stop loss via a reinsurer. So the second line of coverage you probably want to look at will be something like medical stop loss, as it probably is your second most expensive spend for insurance. With that, I'm going to turn the program over to Jesse to hear more about implementation and operations.
Hey, Art, this is Linda. Before we hand it over, we have a couple questions I was wondering if you could address real quickly too. One is the process of starting out small and self-insuring your larger deductibles and to moving to reinsurance for the total limit, as well as how a captive could be structured or discussed in the feasibility process that has private equity ownership, and how to structure that. So if the company is sold, how that could be structured to have a change in ownership.
Okay, well, let me start with the first question. Yeah, there's no rule that says you have to abandon the direct insurance market for medical malpractice and then form a full-fledged captive and start buying reinsurance. We've seen companies use captives to buy down deductibles, and then frankly, it's probably a better way to start because it gives the organization the ability to do this in stages, to understand what it means to own a captive, to understand capitalization and premium financing, and you're simply shifting risk that you have as a self-insured over to your insured captive. And then it makes the leap to a full-fledged captive where you're taking all of your medical malpractice risk and accessing reinsurance markets and having to set up a TPA organization and an RMIS and a risk management organization. It breaks it into two parts. So Linda, that is a good idea for small to medium-sized organizations that are going into captives to do it in steps, unless they already have a lot of that pre-existing infrastructure. In terms of your second question, private equity firms owning captives, generally speaking, private equity and captives don't necessarily mix well. If private equity firms are involved in captives, it's generally going to be their companies that are going to have a captive. And we have seen plenty of organizations that have captives that have been bought by private equity firms that have continued to run their captive successfully. And then when they're spun off, they take their captive with them. We have also seen organizations who are owned by private equity form captives But again, it's going to be formed by the insured itself, not necessarily the private equity firm, because when private equity decides to exit a business, they don't want a lot of residual liabilities left over. Linda, I hope I answered your questions there.
Yeah. So definitely, it is possible to go ahead with the private equity ownership to form and have that go if it is sold as part of the assets going forward. Correct?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Thanks. And I'll go ahead and hand it over to Jesse.
Great. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Art. I'll just add quickly on the private equity question too. I've seen those structures. Oftentimes private equity will be using a holding company type structure where they'll, own assets such as a captive through that. And it makes for the transfer of that type of entity feasible. So I agree with the comments made. So I've been asked to join the conference today to talk a little bit about post-feasibility, and what that means is primarily once you've gotten through feasibility and you've made that decision that it's a green light and a go, what's next? And so I'll pick it up with really, now you're going to start your interactions with the regulators in filing an application in the chosen domicile state to form your captive. And then I'll also talk about once we've obtained the captive license and you start operating, what are the nuts and bolts of running and operating a captive? Because I think one of the big questions folks who are new to captives wonder is, what's the level of commitment? How much time is this going to take? And I don't know anything about insurance. How can I suddenly be operating an insurance company? So I hope some of what I tell will put some of those fears to rest and show how this is a very doable enterprise for any type of business. And in fact, captives are being flexibly used in all types of business enterprises. So here on this first slide, we're talking a little bit just about the very initial things coming out of feasibility. Oftentimes, the entity helping with you with feasibility may be a captive manager, so you may have that selected through that feasibility, but sometimes it's not. And what you have to first determine is, okay, who are the service providers that are going to take me through and get this captive put together and licensed in the domicile. So your key folks there are going to be your captive manager, who's sort of the quarterback of the project, and then your domicile attorney, who will handle the legal aspects and regulatory pieces within that select state. Key points on that really is you should be careful in terms of your selection, that you want to have folks who have a great deal of experience in the type of captive you're doing. So here, of course, we're talking about medical professional liability captives for hospital groups. There are domiciles, that are very experienced in those. There are others that are less so. And similarly, there are insurance managers and attorneys who are more verbose, more learned in those types of businesses than others. So that's a piece of your questions you want to be asking as you're doing your RFPs on those types of folks. Once you've got that team put together, you're going to be wanting to dig deep down now into some of the issues you've dealt with in feasibility, is these legal and tax advice regarding the structure and the ownership, because there are many ways to form and structure a captive insurance company. And just because your feasibility tells you that, okay, it makes sense from a financial point of view, there are various levers that could be pulled that could enhance or make those financial results less attractive depending on how you form this. So that's where tax is very important. But a few things just kind of linking back to what we talked to before. For instance, one thing that's very attractive in the market today is these protected sell or sponsor captives that Art talked about. Those offer really a turnkey sort of entry-level captive opportunity, and that can be of interest to a smaller entity or someone that is trying to dip their toe into the world of captives, but is hesitant regarding capitalization requirements or trying to save money on some of the initial entry costs. It can be a way to incubate a captive, build up some surplus within your cell in early years, and then even, move it to a standalone captive later on. So if clients who've done that, there's others who just operate and stay in cells. The downside of a cell structure is really control, because again, you're entering someone else's captive. Your rights come through a participant contract, so you basically have contractual rights as to what you can do within your cell, but you don't have the same level of governance and control of an affiliated subsidiary the way you would if you formed your own captive. Other things to think about specific, I think, to hospitals is I've worked with numerous nonprofit hospital groups through the years. And oftentimes when you're dealing with captive insurance and nonprofits, attractive structure is a reciprocal, which is a type of legal entity. It's akin to a partnership, but it exists only in the world of insurance, and it can enhance the tax benefits you get from a nonprofit status and bring those over to your insurance company as well. So these are things that, again, you want experienced folks who will be able to cite these types of opportunities and steer you in the right direction. So once you've done some of this initial groundwork and put that in place, thank you for moving to the next slide. We can talk a little bit about the application that you'd be starting to put together, again, with your captive manager as the quarterback, and then your other service providers, which will be brought on board. So initially, obviously, you're going to need to select a captive name and get that approved with the domicile regulator. Other sort of initial get started pieces, you've got to put together directors and officers for that company. Those folks, the size of your board is really up to you. Usually a minimum size of a captive would be a 3-person board. We see boards that are very large. It really depends on your own internal operational desires, and sort of, there's pros and cons either way. On the one side, a small board is nice in terms of it keeps it very efficient in terms of holding meetings and making decisions. However, if you're in a group structure where you're dealing with multiple entities or persons who are decision makers, oftentimes just you will need to have a larger board to make sure you have the appropriate voices represented. Those persons that serve as directors and officers, they are fiduciaries to a regulated entity. And so the states that domicile captives, they take the regulation of these insurance companies seriously. And one of the things that they do require when you file your application is that those fiduciaries fill out biographical affidavits. And they're fairly detailed documents that spell out your experience and talk about your addresses, where you've lived. It basically gives all the background that a regulator could want to be able to understand and make sure that a fiduciary of a regulated insurance company is an appropriate individual and doesn't have a background they would prefer not to have overlooking a regulated entity. The last piece there in the getting started section is really preparation of your governance documents. So here you'd be working with your domicile attorney, and you'd really be focusing now at this point in those documents on initial governance decisions. So you'll put those documents together, and they will become part of, in draft form, part of your application. So addressing the details, the second box, more of what we're putting together to craft this application. One of the key documents in there, of course, is a narrative business plan. So as Art described during the feasibility stage, you really will be putting together, what coverages make sense in the captive, what would the limits be, deductibles and such, and also studying, what type of risk and loss prevention programs are in place already and what things could be added to enhance the value of the captive. One of the things that many clients find is that when they go through the process of formally putting together a captive and taking these sort of very controlled and well considered steps, is that they start to appreciate risk control in a way they never did before. And so oftentimes the captive has this added benefit in that you start to become more risk compliant within your own industry or enterprise. So that will get spelled out within that business plan. There's an auditor and actuary that would have to be selected. these folks have to be approved within the captive domicile. Most domiciles have an approved list. And what they do is the auditor is responsible for putting together the required annual audited financial statements for captive. Those get filed with regulators on an annual basis. And then the actuary, which Art talked in some degree about, is responsible for putting together your annual feasibility study, which again it's an important document as the actuary establishes what the reserves, your loss reserves are, which are basically your primary liability that appears on an insurance company's balance sheet. So that's an extremely important component, and you need to have a good actuary who can understand your business and prepare those certifications that regulators will also review. We have here pro forma financials and the feasibility study. So I just referred to the actuary's work. One other piece they do is they put together a feasibility study that will be part of the application, and the regulators will actually have an independent actuary review that as part of their 30-day review process. The pro forma financials, they look ahead 5 years and basically give regulators a snapshot of what is an expected result for the captive from a financial perspective. They also are required to have an adverse scenario so that regulators can understand what what things would look like if, in fact, losses came in worse than anticipated. A couple other things there quickly we'll hit. Just basically, we need to talk about how the captive would need to be capitalized. There's requirements within domiciles about what capital requirements consist of. So oftentimes you have a minimum capital requirement. That's money that the regulators view as needs to be very liquid assets available at any time. And the reason is that regulators are always watching out in the case that they had to take over an insurance company and actually operate it themselves and do a runoff. So they want to be sure there's always money sufficient to pay for those services to do that. But outside of that, there's surplus capital, and there's regulations regarding how that capital comes in and how it can be invested. So that's something that will be studied and understood. And then finally, in the application, you'd have, or part of basically getting ready to operate, you'd be developing your insurance policies and negotiating any reinsurance agreements that you'd have with reinsurers. The last steps in that application process is your meeting with the domicile regulator. So at this point in the process, you've got a good idea of your business plan. It's being put together. You understand quite well the structure, how you're going to be legally formed. And it's the right time to meet with the regulators and give themselves an introduction to yourselves, to your business. And again, the captain manager quarterbacks this process. At that time, the captain manager will give the regulators sort of the sneak preview of what will be appearing in the application. And that way, understand if there are any questions or roadblocks, we can address them early on before we get down the road with the application. So finally, you finalize your application, get that submitted to the domicile regulator. And at that same time, they get an initial look at your incorporation documents. They'll give a nod of approval if they approve of the structure, and then you can move forward to actually formally create the legal entity that the captive will be. And from a legal entity point of view, there's quite a degree of flexibility depending on your domicile. So you'll see captives formed in all types of different structures, but stock corporations, limited liability companies, mutuals, and nonprofits are all possible structures. So on this next slide, we talk a little bit about what happens once you file the application. So most domiciles, they will give you they say that they have a 30-day review process, and that gives them time to do the independent actuarial review and then fully get under the hood with the application, ask any questions, and deal with any issues that they might need to see evaluated and finalized before they can issue a license. And so during that 30-day period, that's where legally you're fairly busy putting together the last organizational steps. So we'll have an organizational meeting that oftentimes is done by a consent, and it's a time where you can do all the organizational steps such as setting up the bank accounts, issuing stock, etc. And at the end of that 30-day process, you'll have the insurance license issued, and with your operational steps being done, you'll be ready to go right into doing business, writing insurance. We can move to the next slide. So talk a little bit about captive operations. So on the first slide, I wanted to just point out, at this point, trying to understand, well, what does it mean to be on a board of directors and how much work does that mean? I think it's, again, important to understand that, none of you probably run an insurance company, so you are going to be working with your captive manager and they'll be quarterbacking this. And from a board of directors standpoint, over the time or life of a captive, you do develop these committees that are pictured here to actually help spread the work out and involve different expertise that are within your organization and within your service providers to assist you to do that. So here, just briefly, underwriting committees, what they do is basically monitor risk profile and what risks you're going to allow into the captive. The risk management committee, once you've allowed risk in, how do you control and reduce that risk? And then the finance investment committee, that's really handling audit, actuarial work, and the financial overview. So, this work does get delved out and separated among different groups. I know we're short in time, so I'll move to the next slide. And here we're talking a little bit about the role of the captive manager. And I thought I'd let Art, since he is a captive manager, speak briefly on this one.
Thanks, Jesse. And just kind of a quick review, we've talked about all of the kind of things that you have to do to form a captive, all of the processes that are involved, the governance involved. So we've spent the last 55 minutes making it complicated. I'm going to try to simplify it. Most companies will outsource captive management to a captive manager. There are, as you noted earlier, almost some 7,000 captives in the world, and my guess is no more than 20 of them are self-managed. Most are outsourced to either the three major brokers or small independent management firms, and that outsourced management will take care of doing all the regular accounting and financial statements that will be sent to your CFO to be consolidated, and will act as a general contractor, making sure that everything that's supposed to get done does get done, meaning that the money gets invested, the regulatory work is done, the annual meetings get scheduled, the audits get scheduled, policies get issued, invoiced, money collected, claims get recorded properly. If you need a resident director, as some jurisdictions require it, we'll provide that resident director as well. Issuing the policies, providing the technology systems that are going to be required from a captive perspective, making sure that we're always compliant, coordinating access with reinsurance markets. Some jurisdiction will actually serve as the company secretary and take minutes during the annual meetings. And make sure the corporate governance is going on. So every captive management assignment is a little bit different, but that kind of highlights the things that you should expect from a captive manager. And with that, Jesse, I'll turn it over to you for the last couple of slides.
Great, thanks, Art. So the last couple of slides just really give a overview of the operations of a captive, the basic operations on an annual basis, what you're sort of handling and dealing. So you see these are broken out into different components, but there's here key items listed and then some indications of what the client's role in it. And it backs up what Art was saying. As much of it is client is providing internal information, reporting out to the captive manager and allowing the manager and the other service providers to then effectuate what needs to be done to comply with regulation. So here, just very briefly going through, much of this is going to be handled throughout the year, either directly through communications with your manager on the day-to-day operations, or from a corporate perspective as fiduciaries, as directors, within your board meetings. So at a basic level, you'll have to have at least one annual meeting of a captive. It depends a little bit on the sophistication and ownership as to whether additional meetings would be needed, but a single parent captive oftentimes can have a single annual meeting. And at that time, you'll have to meet certain regulatory requirements in terms of reviewing and approving your audited financial statements, your actuarial certifications and such. But I see that it is 3:01. I want to leave time for a couple of questions. So Linda, did we have questions? I don't want to push over if there are things we want to address.
Thanks, Jesse. We did have one other question about challenges by physicians when you're forming these captives, and in particular, when you have physicians that have tribute plans from their current insurance company, their commercial insurance company. And I'll go ahead and start that one. So it's handled a number of different ways. So for those who don't know, if some insurance companies as a retention program have these programs such as called tribute plans, and then they put a portion of their premium in every year as a deferred compensation program. So the physicians will have a balance within their program to be paid should they stay insured with that company until they retire. So I've had some companies, and they, and even hospitals as they begin employing, but the physician groups have handled it a number of different ways. One is they feel that if it's an employment model, the new employer feels that they can make that decision, and they have equated the cost of tailing out a policy to the value that's in the tribute plan balance. So for example, if a doctor has $50,000 in that tribute plan, it's very restrictive. There's a lot of articles out there about it, whether that is going to be paid. And second, they have to stay insured with that company until they retire. So that's, again, one of the retention bonuses by staying with them. So the new physician group has said, instead of paying you out that $50,000, we're going to cover the cost of your tail policy to change to a different insurance company that may be less expensive. And they figure that's a wash. I've actually had some physician groups pay the tail, the value of that tribute balance to the physicians. And I've had physicians come up and, speak to me about, their balances. And sometimes it's only a couple doctors have it, and sometimes there's a lot of doctors that have it. So they do handle it in a variety of different ways. And it is something that needs to be addressed, but really saying that, physicians change jobs and they change insurers. So sometimes the physicians are walking away from those balances. So I don't know if Art or Jesse, you have anything else to add to that, but that was one of the challenges in overcoming physician biases to change insurance companies and move to a captive insurance company. And our suggestion to do that is to find physician leadership or do some ongoing education to the physician members of the group. And provide a Q&A type of town hall meeting. And then as well as you could structure so there is some potential for them to have financial gain in the ownership of the captive as a shareholder. So I don't know, Art or Jesse, do you have anything further you want to add to that?
Yeah, Linda, I mean, it's all about the numbers, and it's something that the actuary takes into account when they set prospective premiums going forward. There's always a component in there for tail. In one of the physician RGs that I worked with, they actually made a conscious decision to exclude doctors that were within 3 to 5 years of retirement, because there wouldn't have been enough time to build up a tail. So they stayed out of the group. They didn't have to put in capital. They continued to buy insurance from the company they were buying from. And then, when they just looked at the census and figured out what the tail would be, and even though they were going to be losing some of the tail cover, recognized that for the long haul, it was a better financial deal.
Right. Okay. Any other questions outstanding? If you could chat those away. Again, we apologize for going a little bit over, but it was an interesting discussion. And if you have further questions, please reach out to me or any of the speakers, and we'll make sure that we get back to you. And we appreciate your joining us today. Okay, with no further questions, we will go ahead and adjourn this meeting. Everyone have a great day. Thank you. Oh, thank you.